In the first 20 years of his reign, Ramesses II undertook great projects and achieved impressive things. Capped off with the peace treaty of year 21, the pharaoh of Egypt, Usir-Ma'at-Ra, could look back on 2 decades of success. And he could look forward to year 30, when he would celebrate his magnificent Sed Festival. To get there though, Ramesses would endure hardships. We have already spoken of Queen Nefertari, her passing and burial in a magnificent tomb around year 25. Well, that funeral was merely one in a string of deaths that occurred during this phase. Where the first 2 decades were a time of gain, the third was a time of loss. It began with Ramesses' mother. Around the same time as Nefertari, perhaps slightly before, the queen mother Tuy, or Tuya, also passed to the west. She had been a prominent figure in Ramesses' early reign. As the Mut Nesut, or mother of the king, Tuy appears on monuments together with her son. And in the great memorial temple, which we call the Ramesseum, Tuy and Nefertari had their own special chapel. The Queen Mother may not command the same headlines as Nefertari, but she had her own influence and prestige. In some cases, she may even have outranked her daughter-in-law. One of the best records for this is a letter that Tuy sent to the Hittites, in which she spoke directly to Hattusili and even addressed him as, quote, "Great King of the land of Hatti, my brother." The fact that she could do that and treat Hattusili as an equal is quite remarkable. Even Nefertari never went that far. Without reading too much into it, Tuy may have been the more prestigious individual, at least diplomatically. Like Nefertari, Tuy went to her rest in the Valley of the Queens. In fact, the 2 ladies were neighbors. The entrance to the grave of Tuy is just next to Nefertari's, behind the seating area if you're visiting. Architecturally, Tuy's monument is nearly identical to Nefertari's. Unfortunately though, the preservation is much worse. Tuy's grave was flooded in antiquity, and later used as a living space by hermits, who dwelled amid the rubble. Most of the plaster and painted decoration are lost. There is little to see, except walls of bare rock. However, the tomb did have its secrets. When excavating the space, archaeologists found a wine jar. It bore the cartouche of Ramesses II and a date, year 22, recording the harvest. Logically, Tuy must have died and gone to her funeral sometime after that. Another loss in the royal house. Thus, by year 26, around 1267 BCE, 2 of Egypt's most powerful women had died. Nefertari, the Great Wife, and Tuy, the Queen Mother, were gone. That left one more prominent lady in Ramesses' household, a woman named Iset-Nofret. Iset-Nofret, or Isis the Beautiful, is the other wife of Ramesses II. Sadly, if you thought Nefertari's tale was kind of shadowy, Iset-Nofret's is even worse. We know almost nothing about this woman. You won't find her at Karnak, the Ramesseum, or the Nubian temples. She's absent from the diplomatic archive. Compared to Nefertari, Iset-Nofret is all but invisible. After Nefertari died, Iset-Nofret may have gained the rank of Great Royal Wife, Chemet Nesut Weret. That is uncertain, though. Only a couple of monuments survive with this title, and they might have been produced after her death. At least, that is the argument put forth by Claude Obsemer and Peter Brand. I'm hesitant on it myself, but one thing is clear. If Iset-Nofret did enjoy a time of preeminence, it was remarkably short-lived. Once again, this lady is totally absent from records of the Sed Festival. On current evidence, it's quite likely that she also died before year 30. Thus, if she did achieve supreme queenly status, her time in the spotlight lasted a few years at best. Where was she buried? We don't know. Unlike Tuya, Nefertari, and several of Ramesses' daughters, archaeologists have never found the tomb of Iset-Nofret. It might be located in Saqqara, the great necropolis of the north, because one of Iset-Nofret's sons, the famous prince Kha-em-Waset, was particularly active in that area. He built monuments for himself and his family just west of Saqqara itself. It's possible that Queen Iset-Nofret lies undiscovered somewhere in that area. For now, though, we can only speculate. Fortunately, while Iset-Nofret did not enjoy the greatest fame in life, her legacy was far more enduring. First, after her death, Iset-Nofret's daughter would ascend to great status in the royal house. Secondly, for all of the male children which Ramesses and his wives produced, ultimately it was one of Iset-Nofret's boys that would survive to inherit the throne. We'll cover those stories as they develop, but in terms of the political history of Egypt, Iset-Nofret was the most influential of Ramesses' queens. By year 30, Ramesses had buried his mother, his great wife, and his second wife. But his losses were not over yet. Sometime in the 3rd decade, the king's eldest son also passed to the west. The prince Amun-her-khopeshef, or Amun is upon his sword, is the most prominent and best recorded of all Pharaoh's sons. From the very start of his reign, Ramesses had promoted him as the king's eldest son, Sa-nesu-semsu, hereditary noble, Iri-pat, and king's first son of his body, Sa-nesu-tepi-en-khetef. This combination of epithets marked him out uniquely as the designated heir, and for all his life he would prepare for the succession. From childhood, Amun-her-khopeshef had trained. He gained literacy and the recognition as a king's scribe, Zecha-nesu. He also participated in military life, perhaps accompanying his father on campaigns. On temple walls, we see the prince riding his chariot into battle and presenting captives to Pharaoh following the victory. He also shows up with military titles like Great Overseer of Troops, or General, the Imira Meshawer. Now, those are monuments and art, not reality itself, but they probably reflect a genuine education. Amun-her-khopeshef was destined to be a king, and Egyptian monarchs were first and foremost warlords. It's reasonable to assume that Ramesses educated Amun-her-khopeshef in the business of war. By year 20, Amun-her-khopeshef would be about 25 years old, give or take. We don't know if he married, but he did have at least one son, whom he named Seti, after his grandfather. Sadly, that's all we can say about the prince. Like Nefertari, Tuya, and Iset-Nofret, Amun-her-khopeshef probably died before year 30. The prince is absent from his father's Sed Festival, and just a few years later, one of Amun-her-khopeshef's brothers shows up with the titles of Crown Prince. So the eldest son must have departed this life sometime in the 3rd decade. Ramesses buried his eldest son in the Valley of the Kings. Despite its name, the valley is not just the burial place of pharaohs, but also family members and courtiers. Amun-her-khopeshef went to his grave in a tomb that archaeologists know as KV5. This is quite an interesting one. First uncovered in the 1820s, KV5 appeared to be a small, unremarkable monument. Just a couple of chambers were visible, and they were full, floor to ceiling, with debris. Explorers tried to tunnel through the mess, but it was quite difficult, and finding no significant artifacts, they soon gave up. As a result, KV5 languished in obscurity for decades, and after a while it actually disappeared, buried beneath sand and rubble from other excavations. But then the monument surprised everyone. In 1987, an archaeological team led by Dr. Kent Weeks relocated KV5. The tomb was in poor condition, filled with mud and rubble that had mixed together and hardened almost like cement. Based on the 19th century records, the team thought there would be just a couple of chambers, a few seasons' work, and it should be fully done. It turned out more than anyone bargained for. As the work progressed, the team uncovered more chambers, and more, and more, and more. To date, over 100 passageways, halls, and burial rooms have come to light, and the team still hasn't reached the end. There could be as many as 150 before all is said and done. The result is that KV5 is now the largest known tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Not the longest or the most beautiful, but in sheer size, this one outstrips them all. It turned out that KV5 was the burial place for multiple sons of Ramesses II, including Amun-her-khopeshef. One of the very first discoveries in the outer chambers were beautiful artistic scenes that showed the prince in the company of his father, and subsequently excavations in the other chambers have found shabti figures and even canopic jars belonging to Amun-her-khopeshef and several of his brothers. KV5 seems to be a massive, multi-burial project for dozens of Ramesses' children. To date, the work carries on, with no end in sight. The death of Amun-her-khopeshef was yet another blow to the king's household. In the space of just 10 years, Ramesses lost his great wife, his mother, his second wife, and his firstborn son. You have to wonder how he felt. Did the accumulation of loss build into a cloud of grief? Or, as these deaths passed in quick succession, did Ramesses wonder if his own end was not too far away? Perhaps, as he took Amun-her-khopeshef to his grave, Ramesses looked over at the door of his own tomb, already under construction. Would he soon be joining the departed? The pharaoh need not have worried. While he had been in power for 3 decades, Ramesses II was not even halfway through his reign. In fact, it would soon be time for a major anniversary. It was time for Ramesses' Sed Festival. In 1263 BCE, Ramesses II celebrated 30 years on the throne. Now it was time for his jubilee. The Sed, or Sed Festival, was a grand affair to rejuvenate the life and power of the divine monarch. The festival is ancient. Records for it date back to the very start of the kingdom. Generally speaking, monarchs seem to have celebrated it after 30 years in power, repeating the festival periodically thereafter. Notably, Ramesses was the first king in decades to actually reach that threshold. In fact, by 1263 BCE, there hadn't been a Sed Festival for 100 years. As far as the records show, this was going to be the first jubilee in living memory. The king had looked forward to this for a long time. As early as year 2, Ramesses was decorating temples like Karnak with references to the Sed. In the great hypostyle hall, gods like Amun-Ra bless the young king and offer him, quote, millions of Sed festivals, even holding out little symbols of the Sed hieroglyphs. Ramesses was looking ahead. Later, as the years went on and the king seemed more likely to reach his 30th year, he started preparing the location of his jubilee. This would be at Men-Nefer, or Memphis, specifically in the great temple of Ptah. Here, Ramesses commissioned a magnificent festival hall, which archaeologists uncovered in the early 1900s. The structure was its own separate building, with great pylons comparable to those of Luxor Temple. It had a hall of columns similar to Karnak, and space for processions and displays of the royal pageantry. The work was organized by one of the king's sons, a prince named Ka-em-Waset. We know that because foundation deposits buried near the hall include the cartouches of Ramesses II, the names of Ka-em-Waset himself, and the hieroglyphs for the Sed Festival. Apparently, as part of his royal duties, this prince organized the Jubilee. Finally, in year 30, it was time for the celebration. The word went out, delivered by Ka-em-Waset. An inscription describes it as, quote, Year 30, the first occasion of the Sed of Ramesses II. His Majesty decreed that the Sed Festival should be proclaimed in the entire land by the king's son, Ka-Emwaset. End quote. A small inscription that conceals a whirlwind of preparation. The Hebsed was a moment of great pageantry. The king himself would be at the center, but there were many witnesses. The great and powerful of Egyptian society would gather to pay homage to the monarch. Embassies would come from distant lands, especially Nubia and Canaan, to give their tribute to the great pharaoh. Finally, the sacred statues of gods and goddesses would leave their respective temples and come visit the king at his jubilee. With so many important guests, you can imagine the Nile River thronged with traffic, barges laden with supplies, the sailing boats of nobles, the unusual craft of foreign ambassadors, and the glittering ships that carried divine statues. Amid these fleets converging on Men-Nefer, smaller boats would dart back and forth, delivering messages and instructions. The royal city must have overflowed with preparation and pageantry. At last, the event itself began. Sed festivals are relatively infrequent. Most rulers never made it to 30 years, but enough records survive that historians can cobble together an outline of the celebration. I actually described a Sed festival in great detail for Amun-her-khopeshef III back in episode 100. But here's a quick overview of what Ramesses would have done. In the temple precinct at Men-Nefer, or Memphis, Ramesses began his day in a ceremonial palace. He took up his garments, including a heavy white robe that wrapped around the shoulders and hung down to his knees. On his chin, he strapped a long, straight beard. Atop his head, the king placed his double crown, the red and the white, which symbolized the unity of Egypt's two lands. Before leaving his palace, Ramesses made offerings to important gods, beings like Wadjit, the cobra goddess, and Nekhbet, the vulture. These were the Nebti, or two ladies, who each ruled half of the land. As king of the two lands, Ramesses received the blessings of Wadjit and Nekhbet and promises of long rule to come. With that good beginning, the pharaoh could now appear in public. Departing his palace, he entered the open-air court in which priests, dignitaries, and foreign embassies had gathered. The king's son, Ka-Emwaset, acted as a royal herald. Announcing Ramesses' appearance, Ka-Emwaset commanded the gathering to bow, perhaps even lowering themselves, quote, to the ground. The dignitaries, both Egyptian and foreign, submitted to Pharaoh's splendor, paying homage to the king of the two lands. His earthly power recognized, Ramesses now led his followers in procession. They crossed the court and went to that magnificent festival hall, where the king took up his throne. Priests and priestesses came forth with the standards and symbols of great deities, beings like Ptah, Atum, Geb, and Iset. The clergy recited prayers such as, quote, Horus, the king, appears upon his throne, and the sky is unified with the earth. Such proclamations were repeated 4 times, one for each of the cardinal directions. Such rites declared the king's authority over all the world and the cosmos above. Ramesses arose from his throne and led the procession out into another courtyard. Around the perimeter, small temporary shrines held the statues of the gods and goddesses. This was the conclave, or pesjet, which had gathered from all across the land. Ramesses visited the small shrines, and the clergy gathered around them. At each stop, the king burned incense, offered food, and poured libations for the glittering deities. In turn, he received their blessings and their wish for his longevity. Blessings like, quote, I, the god, have nursed Ramesses to be the king of the two lands, to rule that which the sun encircles. I have given him all life. End quote. Ramesses showed scenes like this at Karnak, where the gods promise him multitudes or millions of Sed festivals. An ambitious hope, but one that Ramesses would go a surprisingly long way to achieving. As the offerings multiplied, the first day drew to its end. The king marked this with a series of rituals connected with death, receiving a purification of water, which was done 8 times, literally, quote, 4 times, twice. He then entered a tent, which represented a tomb. The king lay down upon a bed, similar to those that showed up in actual tombs, like Tutankhamun's. It's unclear from the records, but Pharaoh may have spent the night in this tent, presumably guarded by soldiers and attendants, but perhaps sleeping in the place of symbolic death. After all, once the sun set below the horizon, the great god Ra would undergo his own death and rebirth. We hear about that in funerary texts, like the Book of Gates. As the son of Ra, it would not do for a pharaoh to abandon his parent in his time of need. I'm speculating there, but it seems a reasonable guess that Ramesses would spend the night in this kind of ritual. In the morning, a priest representing Jekhoti, or Thoth, appeared in the tent. He came together with the priest of Ptah, which was probably Ka-Em-Waset. The two commanded Pharaoh to rise up, literally to awake as if from death. The passage of night and the reappearance of the sun heralded a new day, and the continuation of the Sed Festival. Ramesses emerged from his tent to receive offerings, and then he finally got to change his outfit. The king discarded his heavy white robe and took up something more comfortable, a kilt and bare chest. This was probably for the best, because now he had to do some exercise. At this point, Ramesses would ritually lift a heavy wooden column. It looked like a tree trunk with flat lines at the top. This was the Djed pillar, a symbol of the great god Osiris. In raising the Djed pillar, Ramesses symbolically assisted Osir in his resurrection, and thus assured his own rejuvenation. A version of this was recorded a century earlier, in the days of Amun-her-khopeshef III. It said, quote, "Erecting the Djed pillar by the king himself, at the daybreak of the Sed Festival, so that he may achieve the state of given life like Ra for ever and ever." End quote. Subsequently, Ramesses performed a running race. This is one of the more famous features of the Sed Festival. It involved a series of laps around the festival court, while wearing the regalia of the ruler. The idea, presumably, was to demonstrate physical fitness and capacity to rule. After 30 years on the throne, Ramesses was already 50 years old, give or take. It was good to check up on his health. Again, images of this event show up in Ramesses' art. At Karnak, you can find him running before the gods, while clutching symbols of rule and authority. In some scenes, he also carries a tube, which contained a roll of papyrus, supposedly declaring the pharaoh's ownership of every place, person, and thing within the two lands. So just as the gods of the cardinal directions had acknowledged his authority over Earth and cosmos, there was also a kind of bureaucratic record of everything which Pharaoh owned. The Sed Festival really covered all bases. A few more ceremonies, some ritual reenactments, more offerings to gods, and then the Sed Festival was done. Again, I covered these celebrations in much greater detail in episode 100 for King Amun-her-khopeshef III, and in the distant future we'll have more opportunities to explore other versions of it. But this gives you the gist of what Ramesses would have done. The Sed Festival was primarily a royal affair, but lest we think it was all about Pharaoh's ego, we must remember these rituals did have importance for the wider Egyptian world. As the divine monarch, communicator between mortals and the great creators themselves, the rejuvenation of the pharaoh's power had important ramifications for nature itself. We get a sense of this in a poem that a scribe copied down during one of Ramesses' Sed festivals. He said, quote, "Praise of the mighty Nile flood for the first Sed festival of Ramesses II. The water has risen to the highest level, so that no levee or dike can withstand it. It has reached the mountains, full of fish and abundant in wild birds. All of its products are a benefit When they are eaten, hearts are happy. The gods are in festival. The black land, Kemet, is joyous in your time. It is prosperous every day. No one is lacking anything. The land is returned to its proper state. The conclave of gods has assembled to proclaim the king's provisions like the grains of sand. His treasury is full to overflowing with every good thing, moringa oil, goose fat, incense, and wine without limit. The granaries touch the sky. Bread is like the sand of the seashore. Father Amun has made for Ramesses perfection in his heart. Long live the Horus, strong bull, the beloved of Ma'at. End quote. The strength of the king and the rejuvenation of his powers was a blessing for Egypt's agricultural society. Dependent upon the Nile flood, their land flourished or perished, seemingly on the whims of gods and the strength of the divine monarch. It's an important reminder of how, while Ramesses does come across as grandiose, bombastic, even pompous, his society had already shaped that role for him. These rituals followed centuries of tradition, and they were seen as a fundamental part of the natural cycle. Completing his exertions, his processions, and countless offerings to the gods, Ramesses could now rest. He had completed his Sed Festival, and he would do it again. Just as the gods promised millions of Sed Festivals, Ramesses would indeed celebrate multiple jubilees. After the first one in year 30, there would be a second in year 33, a third in year 36, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, and many more. Perhaps as many as 14. We'll mention the Sed Festivals as they arrive because some of them have fun records associated. But the first celebration in year 30 was a landmark. In his early 50s, Ramesses rejuvenated his power and prepared for the next phase of his rule. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Next week, we're going to take a little trip to Saqqara. Around year 30, there was one more funeral to conduct, but it wasn't a human. Instead, it was time for Ramesses' son, Ka-Em-Waset, to bury the sacred bull that we know as Apis. Along the way, Ka-Em-Waset was going to begin work on a project that today is one of the more famous monuments. Next time, we explore the tale of Ka-Em-Waset and the Serapeum. Before I go, I'd like to extend my thanks to everyone who supports the show at patreon.com/Egypt podcast. Your generosity is greatly appreciated, and it's thanks to you that I am able to do this show full time. I'd especially like to thank the priests, my top tier supporters. These fine folks are endlessly generous, and I am forever in their debt. My thanks to Frank, Mykost, Chris, Erin, Carlos, Veronica, Ashley, Erjan, Suyon, Setnacht, Dan S., Karen, Yola, Siyen, Jeffrey, Andy and Chelsea, Dan B., Eric, Nidin, Jean, Terry, Andrew L., Kate, TJ, Alicia, and Linda. Folks, you are all wonderful. May the gods of the 4 cardinal directions guarantee your security in this world and the next, and may prosperity come to you like the Nile flood at the time of the Sed Festival. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you soon.